is a sort of reflective essay in a way. Is looking at the value of urban design. I've been a consultant in urban design, and for the last 10 years I've been teaching in academia urban design, and recently set up a new Master of Urban Design and Transport. And what interests me in this talk is to looking a little bit at spatial model of distance from a designer perspective, and give you some understanding of issue. Maybe, I mean, this talk is more like a question than anything else. So while looking at preparing this presentation, I came across some quite interesting comparison in a way. In epistemology of geometry, in the last 2000 years, there's a complicated interplay between, I would say, two basic properties of line regarding, I mean, whether they are shorter or being straight, or, I mean, they are not straight in a way. In urban design, I mean, as well, we have, I mean, this for quite a while, almost like 30 years as well, between transport and urban design, two school in a way between the direct and most kind of like shortest in a way. So I will leave as an opening preamble in a way this aspect. And what I want to show you is, of course, I mean, you're probably all aware of the many distances that exist in urban design and in general as well. There is Euclidean distance, there is Manhattan distance, there is kind of like what catchment area distance. There's distance along a network, which might be mainly in 2D, and then there's distance along kind of like 3D network. But as well, there's many other distance. There's a similarity and dissimilarity distance between two data points, between string, between probability distribution, between two sets. I mean, I guess you see where I'm going. Is as well happening in social network, in film network, in physical network as well. If you take, for example, something called Wasserstein distance, which is an idea of optimal transport, we have that as well in statistics, in image processing, in generative adversarial network, and in domain and adaptation and signal processing. So there's a lot of distance around in a way in everything we're doing. One could paraphrase Oscar Wilde and saying, today, I mean, everybody knows the distance of from everything to everything, but nobody knows about value. I'm exaggerating, but I mean, there's a little bit of that as well happening. So what I intend to do is kind of like take you a little bit through the idea of urban design, and I'm going to kind of like take an example that if you are in London or have been in London, you probably know quite well, is the new King's Cross development. Talk a little bit about the value framework in the age of generative AI in urban design as well. And then talk about distance in terms of comparing, going backward and comparing two schemes that were one which is realized, the one that is realized, and one was a winning scheme initially. But it's interesting to look at those two schemes and then think about, I mean, what are the value and the distance in terms of value of those two schemes. So most of you probably know this area. It was not very well paying in London, and now it's completely a different place, and kind of like not very large, but for London is quite large. So value framework, what do we mean by value framework? I mean, in urban design, let's define a little bit about design. The activities which is kind of urban designer do, and designer do, is kind of the manipulation of spatial form, and in a way, I mean, marshalling the multiple stakeholder values that are around the project, in a way, which is the community, developer, planner, political, existing community, future community, human and non-human, and so on. And kind of delivering something which is an acceptable spatial configuration that could be kind of implemented. And obviously that spatial configuration is an acceptable distribution of value among the stakeholders, with a lot of kind of like back and forth between all those people, depending where you are and what you do. Now, if we look at conceptualization of value, in fact, I mean, the work of David Graeber on looking at kind of like all society have three types of value. Two of them are quite well known in a way. And one of them, the last one, is kind of like coming quite strongly in this time. And so value in exchange is commonly, I mean, what we call financial warfare, and probably everybody understand very well those two. Value in use as well, and then is what makes a difference to people. But value in common is more offensive, what is fair or what we should do in a way. So in that sense, I mean, urban design addresses those three values. It does kind of like do so in doing having to kind of deal with like the financial feasibility of a project, but as well, I mean, kind of like functional validity of the project and so on. So what I'm going to focus here is more the value in common, which sometimes a bit left out, but at the moment is coming back very strongly. What we should do in the age of climate change, for example. So what we call, I mean, value as a moral principle or value in common is like what we understand as important to life. It's like more like an ideal state, or not people want, but what people ought to do or what we should do. I mean, there's very broad way of measuring and kind of like understanding those values today. For example, environmental, economic, or ecosystem service, and so on, and different techniques to understand those things. So one could ask, okay, why is that important? Well, there's different aspect of the value framework. And I think, I mean, in this context, is probably something about what, in relationship to generative AI, when you can generate thousands of options with multiple optimization criteria set, how do you choose? And this is a question that is kind of arising, not theoretically. I've been discussing thing with like a urban renewal authority where they have like a lot of data and a lot of kind of like a generative tool. And the question is kind of arising, say, design become more difficult because, I mean, decisions are more difficult. So what we discuss is like a sort of value framework where you have those different values coming together. So you have exchange value, in use, but as well you have a value in common. And this is a framework which is quite interesting in the sense that it takes different aspects of public good. We can see that, I mean, there's kind of relationship between private good and public good. And that's an important thing. Now, what distance got to do with this in a way? Well, and this is a little bit of a slide, which is not a great slide, but this is a meta-analysis of the value of urban design. And this is like looking at 17,000 paper and then extracting from like 270 what are the different kind of values that are created in health, social, economic, and environment. And what I did was to look further into each paper and then look at where value in a way, so the distance as a key intervening dimension. And what comes strongly is like, I mean, at least 40% of all the paper have a distance to measure value. So there are different kind of metrics, and then there are strong aspects in, for example, in the health and economics, and much less surprisingly, in a way, in environment and social value of urban design. So this is quite not surprising. And if you do the similar, I don't know, something similar exercise in another kind of like meta paper, which was looking at in urban study, all the kind of like algorithms that are used, and most of them equally are using distance. So underlying our notion of value of urban design, there's a lot which is related to distance. Now, what I want to do is a little bit kind of like, how do we deal with distance when we have like many options? And I'm using King's Cross to just give you a feel of that complexity. So this is a two scheme. On the right, you have the one that is being realized by Alain and Morrison. And on the left is a scheme which was developed by Foster and Partner, and which was a winning competition. It didn't happen for some institutional and financial reason, but at the time it was something that could go right. What is interesting is to compare as an example of two different options, which have more or less the same kind of like quantum of building development, more or less. I mean, because they are in the same place and more or less having the same brief and the same constraint, they are very similar, but they are very different. So in a way, the question here is like, what's the distance between those two different schemes? How can we kind of like have a multiple criteria assessment that retain in a way as well their design distinctiveness? To give you a feel a little bit about this design, I mean, there's obvious difference, but let's focus on a few of them. So one of them, for example, is kind of like the relation of cultural value or historical value. The kind of later scheme have retained a major aspect of historical building, and today they are perfectly integrated between new and old, and the difference is major between the two schemes in a way. It is hardly difficult. It's pretty difficult to imagine those schemes without those buildings. Okay. So that's a major difference. And how do we kind of like create a valuation, or what is the distance between those two kind of asset management of cultural value? Another aspect is the kind of like blue-green configuration. One has a very big part, relatively one together. And the other one have something which is much more dispersed in a way, with various kind of like size and various in a way type of like a surface, water in one of them, while the other one has water, but the more has kind of like a water body. And the question then is like, okay, how do we evaluate this distance between those two schemes? The accessibility is probably approximately the same. So for designers, like, how do we retain an understanding of geometry by the ways that public space are distributed beyond kind of like just a quantitative side? And we can kind of course, I mean, have the distribution of the size of the public space, have an overall distribution, but as well, what is their relationship, and then how do they relate to the kind of work configuration? So that question of like, what the distance between those two kind of like set of values. So in this question, I've discussed recently with a friend and with my colleague, and I say, how do we calculate a distance between those two distributions? We were talking about using the Wasserstein distance, which is kind of like how do you move from one distribution to another distribution, which have some certain problem because the two distributions have the same, you have to have same number of feature, and you have as well, I mean, doesn't necessarily retain the kind of like geometric differentiation between the two. So one of the idea was like, okay, can we, for example, then, I mean, have a distribution which is about the configuration, and then understand how those kind of configuration relate in a way. We haven't done anything yet, but we just at the beginning of this reflection. So there's more a question, and if anyone has kind of idea about how to go about this, happy to kind of like discuss, because this is more or less a reflective presentation looking at what is possible. And in the same way, I mean, we look at kind of like there's configuration analysis, but those configuration rarely keep, I would say, the aspect of the qualitative aspect. How do we attach those qualities which are so important in a way how we experience as a body, and not just the abstract entities that kind of like understand cognitively a space where we are located and how we go from A to B or and navigate those places, but how we have this bodily experience and kind of visual, kind of haptic experience with the space, and how do we retain this into the configuration, and how would you compare the distance between those kind of like aspects? But we haven't got an answer. And similarly for some aspect of social, some social value, which is kind of like entertaining different kind of like type of population that not necessarily lives there, but have a kind of like control. And indeed, I mean, as well as the social and cultural value, transforming a transport hub into community in a way. What's the distance between the firm that lives there or work there and the people that kind of the social network. So we have a lot of kind of like way of understanding a place as a designer, more or less abstract, more or less embedded or embody into kind of like the experience. And the question is like, how do we kind of like in the age where we have generative AI, how do we kind of like give an understanding of those aspects? Now, this question is not just limited to the place, but how does it spill over? Where do we stop the analysis? Do we stop, I mean, at the kind of site? Do we stop at kind of layer, which is kind of like a few kind of like 100 meters from the place? Or do we go, I mean, and kind of look at how, actually, I mean, that place is kind of sitting in a wider network, how it's kind of like attracting possibly kind of walker or quite far away, or I mean, how it displays as well in a kind of international network. And of course, I mean, we know that the frequency of use of, I mean, as further away you are, the less, I mean, you go there frequently, but I mean, this is still kind of like a question of impact. So to sum up in a way, what I was kind of like understanding is like how we use all those tools that are generative tool or kind of like analytical tool or computational method. All those tools use one way or another some kind of abstract or embedded or concept of distance, whether it is a graphic notion, which is an abstract one, whether it's kind of around, I mean, more bodily kind of like relationship, but how do we kind of make explicit and embed into those kind of like metric in a way, a question which is about those values that has to kind of manipulate. So in a way, my question is more hanging. I don't have a beginning of an answer yet. It's like what model of spatial distance that are meaningful to the diversity of stakeholders involved in urban design can we use in a way? Is there a kind of like awareness of that kind of like particularity of like the distance that we use as we go about using computational methods? Or do we quite understand as the kind of loss of certain aspects that we need for example, designer? So this is something which is quite important to kind of like research, but as well to people that kind of like teach design. So that's my last slide, and I hope that I mean it maybe triggers some question. Thank you.